the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. It was called the Antiquities Act of 1906. It gave museums, anthropologists, and private collectors free rein to essentially loot the graves and villages of Native Americans. Almost a century later, a new federal law has been passed to give Native American communities the opportunity to reclaim those artifacts, and in some cases, even the remains of their ancestors. What the law does, what it does not do, and what further changes are needed, that's the topic of this edition of Challenge 2.0. So we're very grateful that we have two excellent guests that are going to be sharing their perspective and their wisdom on these very important issues, something that we know too little of in many cases. First, I'd like to introduce Shannon O'Laughlin, who is the Executive Director and Attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs, and is also a citizen of Choctaw Nation. Shannon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and so happy that we'll be talking about issues of American Indians and repatriation today.
And Jay Julius, if you've watched this program before, which of course we hope you have, is not a stranger. We're very pleased that Jay agreed to come back on our program. He is a former chair and council member of Lummi Nation here in Washington State, and continues to serve as an influential leader, advisor, strategist, and also speaker. Jay, thanks so much for coming back on with us today.
Jeff, thank you for having me again. Always a pleasure.
I'd like to begin by asking both of you to recollect the first time you visited a museum or other place and encountered what might be called an artifact of your culture, your people on display, and what your reaction was when you saw that separated from its true context.
So I grew up in rural Oklahoma and did not have any opportunities to go to a museum. Instead, what I experienced growing up in Oklahoma were these horrible signs that would lead tourists to grave sites or graveyards or artifact digging. And sometimes those signs would lead you to the back of someone's house or garage where you could view full human remains and those burial belongings that went with those ancestors. So those were my first experiences, and how it made me feel is it as I looked around my family, it made me feel like we were special in a bad way.
Mm-hmm.
Why would our ancestors and our relatives of people that we knew in the back of someone's garage behind glass, like some type of almost like a circus, an experiment or some sort of weird oddity that people would come to see. So it wasn't a great experience.
Jay, how about your first experience with that you recall?
Jeff, this is a tough question. I live in a county called Whatcom, which is from stems from our language and who we are as Lummi people. And our ceded territory consists of not just mainland, but islands. And it's a tough question because, this whole area, landscape, islands and seascape is like a museum. We've lived here since time immemorial. And compared to other reservations and homelands, ours is, consists of the San Juan Islands and Whatcom County in the border of Canada. And then there was no border, obviously, at pre-contact. That is something new. So as I reflected on this question, we do have a museum here locally in Bellingham called the Whatcom Museum. But it started long before it. It seems like, as I reflect on this, it's a challenge my grandfather, who served the Lummi Nation as a leader, elected leader for 30 plus years. And it was always something he was facing, fighting to protect, to exercise our inherent rights and sovereignty to preserve, protect these sacred items in our ancestors. So it's almost not a trauma, but something we experience almost every single year, whether it's the uprooting of ancestors and development of a home, or big projects in economic development from the city and the feds.
This trade in items of spiritual and cultural significance has sometimes been described as legalized looting. What made that possible in the first place?
I'm not sure if legalized is the right word. I would argue with that term today because tribes have never given up their inherent sovereign right in jurisdiction over their cultural heritage. So I would argue that none of the looting was legalized. But what gave rise to it is that, you know, we're part of a country and a government that has worked to assimilate and terminate Native Americans in order to possess land and resources. And so in an effort to do that, the federal government established policies that removed Native people from their homelands to reservations and areas sometimes far away from their homelands, which opened up land, which of course had our ancestral remains and burial belongings. Also, our homes, our places of religion and our sacred places were abandoned. And so our cultural items and other sacred objects were also abandoned. Once we were moved away from our homelands, there were regulations called the civilization regulations that prevented us from practicing our cultures, our religion, our dance, our language, that demanded that we give up our children to go to boarding schools, and our children were prevented from speaking their language and practicing their life ways. So in order to get food and get shelter and to survive, oftentimes Native peoples had to give up those things. It was an effort of genocide throughout the United States. And so those items that you see for sale at auction today, those items that you see behind glass at museums all over the world, were taken by force and by violence and by unilateral dispossession from indigenous peoples through that whole colonization and genocide process. So I wouldn't call it legalized looting. I would call it actual theft and looting. And it continues today. It continues today. Items are still being looted from tribal spaces and lands. Jay mentioned development that continues, and our graves of our ancestors are continually dug up and investigated, oftentimes without our free, prior, and informed consent.
And I think we have to reflect back to, as Shannon stated, when this began, the perception or the view of us, which is even taught today in 2021 or still exists in the Bill of Rights, in these things that our youth are educated on and brought up with, viewing us as what? less than human, and we know things have changed and times have changed, but unfortunately, that is still not a subliminal message, but something that is instilled into our youth, and as they come up, it's become normalized. So we have to look back at contact. We have to look back at treaty times. We have to look back at policies that allowed genocide or promoted genocide, budgets from states and the government that allowed the genocide to take place or promoted it, and the lack of respect that has led to where we are today still, towards our people, towards our ancestors, and things that are culturally significant and sacred to us.
Shannon, I might ask you now to share with us a little bit about your path, how you became involved with the protection and repatriation of such objects of cultural and spiritual significance.
Right. Thanks for that question. I don't often get to talk about how I started this journey. As you know, I'm an attorney, and I went to law school at the University of Arizona College of Law in their Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy program. And it was about 4 or 5 years out of law school when I moved to New York State and started working with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, otherwise known as the Iroquois Confederacy, which is a confederacy of 6 nations. The Onondaga is the Central Fire. The Western Door is the Seneca Nation, and the Eastern Door is the Mohawk Nation. And the little brothers are Cayuga and Oneida. And a recent addition to those 5 nations were the 6 nations, the Tuscarora Nation from a little bit south that was amalgamated into the 6 Nations Confederacy. And the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which spreads out up into Canada and into the Great Lakes region very deeply, and even into the south of past New York, has a long history with working on repatriation matters since the 1800s. And so when I came on to work with them, and they presented me with working with the Haudenosaunee Standing Committee on Burial Rules and Regulations, the leadership told me that it was my job to help bring the ancestors home, and that they would not be whole again, that their nations could not be whole again until their ancestors were finally put to rest. So that was a lot on my shoulders as a young attorney. And so I really put all the effort I could into thoroughly understanding the laws that applied to repatriation and graves protection and American Indian religious freedoms, to work the best for my client there with the Haudenosaunee. And through that experience and working with them with many museums throughout the United States, I was happily appointed to the NAGPRA Review Committee by Secretary Sally Jewell under President Obama. President Obama appointed me to the Cultural Property Advisory Committee in the State Department, which I was later fired by President Trump. But I've had a lot of work, and especially now with the Association on American Indian Affairs, working with tribal partners on repatriation strategies and health and healing opportunities that come out of this work.
As you undertook these efforts as a young attorney, were there any in particular that really were either emotionally difficult or had a particular emotional tug for you, either of satisfaction or dissatisfaction?
Right. And let me tell you, it's all triggering of trauma. This work, often a lot of work that advocates do in Indian country can be very triggering for trauma, and repatriation is one of those. There was a wampum belt that was for sale at Sotheby's, and we all, a delegation of chiefs and tribal leaders from the Haudenosaunee and myself and others went to New York City to see the belt. And they brought the belt out, and there was just this complete silence and respect. But what I saw from the tribal chief who actually picked up and held the wampum belt is it was almost like a reuniting of people. There was such a kinship with that sacred object, an object of cultural patrimony that was owned, held to be used for the Confederacy. There was such a relationship there,
Mhm.
and that chief cried, and he talked to that belt like it was his child. And the entire room, including the Sotheby's people, were moved. But that's what we find, and we
Mhm.
find that these items have been held in boxes, in shelves, in the dark, and absolutely offending that which we hold sacred.
Jay, if you would share a little bit on how the arc of your life and your leadership intersected with this very issue that we're talking about.
As we went into the process to protect what under National Historic Preservation or the State Historic Preservation listed as a cemetery, the very first registered archaeological site in Whatcom County, 45 WH1, eligible for the National Register, one of many sacred sites in this particular landscape, where the largest coal port in North America
Mhm.
was being proposed to be developed. In 1999 or 2000, as a crow flies about 10 miles north, there was another project that took place, and significant to us. But through that development process, my family was dug up. Not one, not two, not three, but a massive amount. And it wasn't until 2015, like Shannon said, my family sitting in boxes on shelves in the dark, and being who I am, traditionally family, where I come from, I had to take part in a process that no one should ever go through, and that's
Mhm.
um, putting your family members back to rest. And that took place in 2015. So through this fight to protect and preserve our way of life and protect our ancestors, all of this is compounded, and it does become very emotional, and you're very passionate, but at the same time, you want to create empathy and understanding for where you are coming from and your people are coming from,
Mhm.
on the importance of protecting something like this. So creating that empathy was a challenge, but um, it was our chief, similar to Shannon's story, who sat with the colonel of the Army Corps on a log at this place, Huichiacan, this sacred place where this largest coal port in North America was being proposed. And the chief shared with him that this is home of the ancient ones. This is a special place. You can't just look at the physical things and the physical landscape of something like this. And it's a challenge for us to put this into English terms.
Mhm.
And it's a challenge for us to, here at Lummi, I'll speak just for myself and my family and my experience in leadership, to have a conversation with a government that has separated themselves from being one with,
Mhm.
from understanding the sacredness. But I found that when it comes to other individuals in the outside of our community, Lummi community, indigenous community, that if development was proposed over the top of a whole bunch of crosses and headstones, and inadvertent discoveries were put in place, if something was dug up in the process of this development on top of these crosses and headstones, but they would remove them, then it creates an uproar. Then there's empathy and understanding.
Mhm.
But when it comes to us, even today, right now, Jeff, there's still a lack of that empathy and understanding from the pain that this creates in our peoples, not just ours, but all throughout this country. It's happening in Indian country and has been. So that's kind of where, for myself, one of the examples of where it started, but a lot has led up to it, including disturbances and home development, and it's a constant thing.
Shannon, I might ask you to respond to this first, but I think that we have to ask, do the issues extend beyond that of tribal sovereignty to the larger scale issues of racism, white supremacy? Is that fair to say?
That is very fair to say. In fact, tribal sovereignty in our legal jurisprudence has been expressed as being limited by our inferior race. The watershed cases in federal Indian law coming from the United States Supreme Court has cited our inferiority and our savage nature as rationale for removing our sovereign rights. For example, our ability to assert criminal jurisdiction over our lands. There have been several cases that have cited to our inferior court systems and jurisprudence, whether it was traditional or established like a Western court system, as being inferior, and that we can't hold non-Indians to have to go through those foreign tribal court systems. And the treatment of our ancestors and our objects as something that's for scientific reflection only. What that's done is that it's created academic and museum institutions that actually don't know how to educate about Indigenous peoples because they have such a limited scope of information about the things that they have in their collections. What we found is when those institutions have become anti-racist, when they understand what they have in their collections and that their collections are the result of that racism and colonization, and they actually consult with tribes and work with them face to face and actually learn what they have in their collections, and repatriation happens, then what is built there is a collaborative relationship where that tribal nation can actually help that institution educate the public, which is what that institution was supposed to do in the first place, right? So now the tribes and the institution can work together to develop an appropriate program to share with the public about that tribal nation. So it's actually repatriation is healing for all sides.
When it comes to sacred objects, when it comes to human remains and our beliefs, whether you're a Christian, Catholic, Indigenous beliefs in all creation, you believe in the Mother Earth, there are things we all hold sacred to ourselves, and it's beyond just the Indigenous. When we look at what is sacred or ask ourselves what is sacred, what is that? And I think it falls under more than tribal sovereignty. It's a moral obligation. If we're willing to stand to protect something, as I stated earlier, that has crosses and headstones or other sacred objects to others, we are not different. We are a fascinating people. I get that. The history is rich, the history is deep, and we've been here since time immemorial, but at the same time, it needs to be, the laws need to be not designed to work around the tribal issues and The 106 process, for example, is not designed to, it's designed to mitigate. It's designed to move things out of the way. So yeah, I do think it's beyond tribal sovereignty. We have a moral obligation, I think all of us, when we look to our beliefs, when we look to our faiths, when we look to what's sacred to us. Yeah.
These are important, though very hard things for us to hear, to say nothing of how difficult they are to speak of and deal with. There are some glimmers of perhaps some progress in righting some of these wrongs. And obviously, we could not fit that in this episode, but we are going to be examining that in much greater detail in the next episode. So, Shannon and Jay, I thank you so much for joining us and for agreeing to join us in the next episode. And for all of you, we hope you'll tune in again in next week's edition of Challenge 2.0. Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed this program, found our conversations to be informative, entertaining, and thought-provoking, and the vision inspiring of people from different backgrounds who can disagree without being disagreeable, perhaps you might consider supporting our program with a contribution. Your support will not only help our program continue, it will also support the broader efforts of Paths to Understanding, our supporting parent nonprofit organization.